All right. We're going to do Score of the Shore. So I'm really excited to have you all here with me to talk about Score of the Shore this afternoon. As we mentioned before, this is one of the parameters that's available to first-time volunteers, so you don't have to be an experienced volunteer to sign up for this program. And it's also a program that you can enroll in anytime this summer. Enrollment is open through August 31st. We want to get as many folks that are interested involved, so we offer this program enrollment summer round. This is the second to last parameter that we're going to be covering today. We'll be spending the next hour on Score of the Shore. Then we'll take a break at 3 o'clock for 15 minutes, and then we'll move on to Exotic Plant Watch at 3:15, which is also open to all volunteers. I've introduced myself earlier, but I want to make sure I have a chance to do it again in case some people are just joining. My name is Jo Latimore. I am the director of MiCorps. I'm also a faculty member in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Michigan State University. And as you can see, I like to spend time on, near, and in the water. So a little background first before we dive into the procedure. Healthy shorelines, they're really important, and they're important for a lot of reasons. One of them is that they're incredibly important habitat for fish at all life stages, for birds, for amphibians, for the little critters under the water that all those guys feed on. Healthy shorelines help maintain the water quality in your lake. They also limit erosion because of the nice deep roots and protection that native vegetation from grasses to trees provide on our shorelines. And they also slow runoff from rain and storm events from the land around the lake into the lake, which could cause erosion and potentially pollution as well. So healthy shorelines are something that we really want to maintain as much as possible on our lakes across Michigan. Unfortunately, our shorelines are threatened. Development often eliminates the important components of a healthy shoreline, like vegetation, trees, shading, plant growth, and fallen trees in the water itself. A lot of that we remove or disturb when we develop our shorelines by building homes or recreational facilities and so on. So when we add lawn, when we pile rock, when we build seawalls like this one, we remove those good, healthy habitats and replace them with something that's artificial and not necessarily healthy for the lake or things that live in it. And so this is something that we need to be careful about and also track. And I want to show some examples here. Here's an example of some older photography compared to some new satellite imagery of some lake habitat down in the Yankee Springs area of southern Michigan. So here's 1938, and you can see some shoreline here that was undeveloped back in 1938. And over time, 2014, as you can see, same exact location, highly developed. Homes have been built all along the shoreline. You can see docks there, and you can see the canals that were excavated in the wetland area in order to provide more waterfront access to the lake. So pretty dramatic change. Here's another example where you can see an undeveloped shoreline in the late 1930s. And then when we fast forward to 2014, a very, very, very developed shoreline. And you can imagine this is changing the character of the lake a great deal. Imagine how it would look being out on a boat on the water, looking up towards the shoreline, comparing 1938 with nothing but trees and grasslands and so forth around it and wetlands versus modern development. We'll give you one more example, 1938 and then 2014. And maybe you can see the very straight lines here along the shoreline. This is all seawall that has been constructed to replace the natural wetland and shoreline habitat that was there before. So we developed this program called Score the Shore. It's the very newest program within the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program, although it's been around for almost 10 years now. And we developed it in cooperation with volunteers. We had an opportunity to add a new program to the CLMP. And so we asked the volunteers, what do you want to collect data on? What do you want us to add to the program? And we discussed a lot of different options, but it was almost unanimous among the volunteers that we talked to across the state that they wanted a way to assess the health of their shorelines. People were becoming more and more aware that shoreline health was incredibly important to the health of our lakes in Michigan. National surveys done by the EPA and others had noticed that, especially in Michigan and surrounding areas, the number one threat to the health of our lakes and what needed to be protected was our shorelines, because we were, almost loving our shorelines to death because we want to be by the water. But when we come to the water, we often severely alter those shorelines. So we worked with volunteers to develop a protocol that is quite comprehensive, yet it is still volunteer friendly. That was our goal. And it's a standardized approach that allows you to assess the health of your lake's shoreline, to identify the high quality areas to protect, and then also discover opportunities for improvement and restoration that you can take advantage of. This information is very useful locally for lake associations. As opposed to some of our other parameters that we've talked about today, where long-term monitoring over many years is critical to really be able to tell the story of what's going on your lake. Score the Shore is one of the parameters we have where you get really useful information right away. You immediately will be able to identify those healthy areas and then those areas that could be improved, and you'll understand why and how you could improve them by going through the process. So it's very useful right away for education and to inform any lake management planning that you want to do. It's also really useful on a regional and state level because, as I mentioned, national studies have shown that shoreline disturbance is one of the biggest threats, in fact, the biggest threat to many of our inland lakes. And so regionally, the data on the quality of our lakes is really useful to know where we are now, and if we get through improvement or we see decline, what's happening. So really, really useful. There are some really great resources available, I mentioned, for education and learning more about how to best protect shorelines in a lake-friendly way. And two of them I have up on the screen right now. The first one I'll mention is the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership. And this is a partnership of organizations that include MSU Extension and the state of Michigan and many other partners that all have the common goal of protecting the shorelines on our lakes. And so that partnership website, shorelinepartnership.org, has a lot of excellent resources, photographs, pictures, information, guidebooks, lists of plants that you can choose from for different zones, lists of certified contractors that can provide services if you want to hire some professional help to do natural shoreline protection. That's all there on the michiganshorelinepartnership.org site. A related site is our Michigan Shoreland Stewards Program, which is a spinoff of the Natural Shoreline Partnership. And on the highlight of the Shoreland Stewards site is a quiz that you can take where you can answer questions about your own shoreline, property that you own. And it will give you a score on how you answer those questions and whether, kind of how successful of a shoreland steward you are right now. And on those questions that maybe you don't score so well on, it will give you tips and tricks on how to improve what you're doing. You can also, if you score high enough, qualify for an attractive sign that you can post on your property that shows that you are a Michigan shoreland steward and doing your best to protect our lakes by what you do on your own property. A final resource that I'll mention is the Shoreline Living magazine. There's 2 volumes available now. They're available through MidwestGlacialLakes.org. And these are magazine type publications that have a number of stories about people who have protected the shorelines on their lakefront properties throughout Michigan and the Midwest. And hard copies are available, but you can also read the entire publication for free online. You can also get all the photographs that were used to produce these articles and these publications, and they're free to use if you want to share them with your lake association. If you give presentations locally, you can use photographs from the site. So you're welcome to visit MidwestGlacialLakes.org to check out the Shoreline Living publications and resources. All right, back to the CLMP and Score the Shore. So in a nutshell, basically the idea is to divide the lake shore of your lake into roughly 1,000-foot sections and fill out a 1-page report card that gives you a score for how healthy that section of shoreline is. So everything is done at that 1,000-foot of shoreline scale. A small team gets on the boat. All the work is done from a boat, and you troll around the edge of the lake and assess the health of your lake while doing that using these forms. And this, as I mentioned, is a really useful educational tool. It's great information to share with neighbors and people in your community, local decision makers that may be in charge of zoning or planning projects around your lake, sharing information about the shoreline health. And one of the strengths of the program is that it provides a number, a score that you can easily share and is easily understood. Every section will come up with a score from 0 to 100. So your 100 is the best possible, 0 is the worst possible. And so that tends to be common sense for people. They understand that scale, right? We all do. And so it's a really easy way to communicate the results of your work. Of course, keeping in mind that these results aren't regulatory. This is volunteer monitoring, and we can't make anything happen. We can't force anyone to do anything with the information, but it's incredibly useful for understanding and planning. So I'll assume I've convinced you want to do Score the Shore. So let's say we're getting ready to actually go out and do it. Let's prepare to score the shore. This is all filling out paperwork for the Score the Shore and taking some pictures. So there's no special equipment that's really needed. The main thing is having the procedures that you can print out. There's a survey cover sheet that you'll fill out, and then there's one section data form. You make a copy for every 1,000-foot section of your lake. And all of that, as we've mentioned throughout this training, is available online on our website. The equipment you'll need, as I said, nothing terribly complex. We don't provide you with any equipment or bottles or anything for this one. No meters are used. You'll have to provide a boat and all the safety equipment, of course, the copies of the paperwork. Make sure you have pencils or waterproof pens to write with. I've definitely seen important data lost because people used an ink pen and then the sheet got wet and it was made illegible. So be sure to think about that when you're getting your gear together. Clipboards, of course, are helpful. If you have a GPS unit or a phone or a watch that collects or can share GPS coordinates for your location, that can be really helpful, but it's not necessary. You can do it with landmarks as well, and we'll talk about that. Cameras are really useful, digital cameras in particular, to take pictures of things that you see. Again, it's not required, but it can be helpful. Binoculars can also be helpful. And tally counters can be helpful too. And what I'm talking about there are the clickers that count things, because you'll need to count things like logs and docks and that kind of thing. So sometimes having a clicker, especially on a highly developed lake, is really helpful. When to do it, what time of year? We recommend that you don't try and do Score the Shore any earlier than about mid-June. You want the vegetation in the lake and on the shoreline to be fully leafed out. You want to have good vegetative growth because you're going to be looking at a lot of plant life to assess how much there is. And if you're like we still are in parts of northern Michigan where you don't really have all your leaves and growth happening yet, it's not the right time to be doing Score the Shore. The amount of time that it takes really depends on how big your lake is, because every 1,000-foot section of shoreline is rated. So small lakes that have done this can do it in 2 hours or less. But of course, it'll be bigger lakes that are going to take more time. What we have found is that while people are learning the procedure and kind of thinking their way through it, the first couple 1,000-foot sections may take you half an hour or even a little bit more to score for 1,000-foot section. But as you get faster and as you get more familiar with the data sheet, a lot of the questions you'll be able to answer quite quickly, where you're looking more like 15 minutes per 1,000-foot section. And then people often will ask us, how often should I do this? Should we do Score the Shore every single year? Well, you certainly can, but our kind of rule of thumb that we recommend is repeating the survey every 3 to 5 years, because shoreline conditions usually don't change a great deal from one year to the next, unless something big's happening on your lake and you would know about that. In general, every few years, going back and looking at it to see, are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Are we staying about the same? And if there's certain parts of the lake where things are getting better or worse, that can be really, really useful for planning and management. So the first thing you want to do, even if you're, right, chomping at the bit to get out there and start scoring, the thing you need to do first is set up your shoreline sections ahead of time. figure out the beginning and end point of each of those sections. And I have a map here on the screen that shows, here's our volunteer lived right around here. And so number 1, the first section of 1,000 feet was right there. Then here's section 2, 3, 4, 5. And you don't have to be super precise about this. You do the best you can. You may have something on your boat that helps you know how far you've traveled. And if you do, you can use that. A lot of people will get online or even with a paper map and kind of sketch out what they think is roughly 1,000 feet sections. And notice, I'm not trying to curve into all these little curves here on the shoreline. A nice straight line is close enough. You can use Google Maps, which actually has a measurement tool, and you can right click and say measure distance, and it'll show you exactly how far 1,000 feet is. And that can be helpful too. And then on Google Maps, it actually will show you, you can see what the lat and long would be if you have a GPS unit. And then after you've kind of looked at a map and estimated your sections, it's good to just kind of go and take a cruise around the lake to associate your map with GPS coordinates or shoreline landmarks. Again, I said you don't have to have a GPS unit to do this. You can also use landmarks, things like a blue house or a road end or, any particular structure you can see from shore easily from your boat, because you want to be able to go out and do this again and use the same section. So think about somebody who might be doing this again 3 or 5 years from when you're doing it. Will it be clear to them where each section starts and stops? I've got this little warning in caps, please. When you're doing your reporting, don't use people's names for landmarks. We get that sometimes. People will say, Jim Smith's house and Mary Green's house, and they write that right on their data forms and on their maps. And we're concerned about people's privacy. We don't want that to go into our statewide database with people's names written all over it. So we actually go through and have to black out all of those names that are in there before it can go into our database. So we highly discourage you from using people's names for landmarks, even your own. Please don't do that. All right. Again, like I said, if you've got other methods for setting up these 1,000-foot sections, you might have some different ideas. That's totally fine. But the important thing is you're going to want to do it ahead of time. You're not going to want to have your team out there on the boat ready to score the shore, and then you spend half the day arguing about what's really 1,000 feet, right? That's not a good use of everyone's time. All right, let's say you've got your sections all set up and you're ready to go. Let's actually get into the scoring process. So in general, we recommend that on the boat, there should be at least 3 people. One person who's just going to drive, because there's going to be a lot of maneuvering the boat around those sections, and at least 2 others to discuss your answers to the questions on the scoring sheet and to make sure you come to agreement. That can be really, really helpful. Now, as I go through this general process, this is kind of what we recommend from our experience going out in the field with volunteers on a number of different lakes. But you might find a different process that works well for you, but we find that this works really well. Being that once you're out there and you're ready to do your first section, consider driving the boat back and forth 3 times. So the first time you go out, be out a ways from score, maybe 100 yards, then go back in and go back the other direction, but closer. So you can see some features that are close to the, hard to see if you're far out, you need to be a little bit closer. And then the last few questions are better done again when you're farther out, and that'll get you back to where you need to be to go to the second section. You'll answer these questions on every pass. It's good to have, you can even make extra copies of the data sheet so people can fill it out themselves, and then you can compare notes to see if you agree on your answers. And of course, the driver will just hold you in place while you reach consensus on the answers to your questions, and one person will record the final answers that go into your report. Back home, there's a little bit of math to do to calculate your final scores, and that data forms walk you right through that. It's quite straightforward. All right, now I'm showing you the data form cover sheet. This is the report cover sheet that'll go on top of your report. Basic information, lake name, county, township, your field ID number, the names of all the volunteers that participated, the dates of the survey. And notice we have an S on dates. It's okay if this takes you a few days of effort. Maybe you go out a few afternoons during the course of the summer to go out and finish this. That's okay. Just let us know what those dates are. We also ask a few questions about the lake level during the survey. Was your lake's level average or normal, or was it low or high? Because as you might imagine, if the water is really high when you go and do your survey, you might not be able to see some of the shoreline features that are normally visible when the lake is down. So that's something to keep in mind. And in fact, if your lake is high, but it doesn't feel like it's going to stay high very long, like maybe you got a big storm or sense of storms or, that kind of thing where you're like, okay, it'll probably come down in a couple of weeks. You might want to wait so you can see things. We also have you mention whether the lake has a legal lake level and what the gauge reading was, because again, the level of the lake can impact your results. And we give you a space to comment on that. Like, wow, yeah, the lake was really high. And so we couldn't really see. We know there's some seawalls, but they were completely underwater, for example. The bottom half of that sheet is where you do some math, where you're going to add up the number of surveys or sections you surveyed. You also mention, kind of to figure out a lake-wide scale score for your whole lake. So again, some fairly basic math that will let you get a lake-wide score, not just for each section, kind of an average score for your entire lake. Pretty straightforward. All right, that's the cover sheet. And then this that I'm going to show you now, this is the scoring sheet. This is the sheet that you'll make a copy of for every section, 1,000-foot section on your lake. And so I'm going to just show you some major features here, and then I'm going to walk you through pictures of what we mean for all of these questions that we ask. So we'll see it once here and then more detail here in a minute. So fill out, let's say you're on section 1, you might write the section number right here, write the name of the lake and the county that you're in at the top, and also the date that you did this section. Describe a landmark or write the GPS coordinates at the start of the section here at the top. Now, you're going to take your first pass along that 1,000-foot section with your boat out a ways from shore, maybe 100 yards. And all you're going to do during that first pass is count the number of homes and major buildings, write it here, and the numbers of docks and boat lifts, write it here. And again, a question we get a lot is like, well, what if there's a house that we know is there, but you can't really see it from the boat? It's behind some trees. What we suggest and what's in our protocol, only count things you can see from the boat. That's an easy way to know where to draw the line. If you can't see it from the boat, don't count it. So there we go. That's your first pass. And it also gives you a chance to just kind of get familiar with the section you're going to be assessing. Then come in a little closer, get close as you feel comfortable and safe to the shore. And you're going to look a little more closely. First, we're going to look at the littoral zone or aquatic zone. So here's our very complicated diagram here. Here's a home, here's the trees, and this is on land. This is your riparian zone here close to the water. And then the littoral zone is down here close to shore, but in the water. So first we're going to look in the water in the littoral zone. So first, what's the percentage of emergent and floating vegetation? And remember, everything you're answering is about that entire 1,000-foot section. So you would answer, is there none? If there's no emergent or floating vegetation, you'd check here and the score would be 0. If there was some, but it was less than 10% of that 10,000 or that 1,000 feet, you'd check this line and you'd get 1 point. Was it 10 to 25% covered by emergent and floating vegetation? 2 points, and so on. 25 to 75% for 3 points, or greater than 75%. You get 4 points for that. And you'll see we're going to continue to have other questions that use the same percentage scale. Also for submerged vegetation. Also, we'll ask about in that near shore area, is aquatic plant management known? Is anyone treating the weeds? Is there plant harvesting going on? Things like that. And you would say either no, or there's minor plant management, or there's major plant management. Now, what you're probably catching on right now is that this is pretty subjective, right? You're not measuring many things. You're counting docks and that kind of thing, but most things is kind of your judgment. And that's why it's good to have 2 people at least kind of talking about, do you agree? Is this just minor plant management, or do we think this is major plant management? And we'll show some examples of what we mean by each. And the examples are also included in the procedures document. You'll look at the amount of downed trees or other woody debris in the water. You'll look at if there's any evidence of erosion along the shoreline. So that's your second pass. Then the bottom half of that data sheet, you're back out, take the boat back further out and answer some questions about what you see on shore. How much of the 1,000-foot section is lawn, beach, or impervious surfaces? What percentage is covered by an unmowed vegetation belt? So a riparian buffer zone of unmowed plant life. How deep does that unmowed vegetation band go? Is it only like a foot deep, or does it stretch, 10 feet upshore or 100 feet up? You're looking at that as well, and we'll see pictures. And then the last stuff you're looking for is any examples of shoreline erosion control that's happening along the shoreline. Do you see artificial vertical structure like seawalls? If so, how much of the 1,000-foot section has that vertical structure? Do you see sloped artificial? So like sloped rock along the shoreline. We'll see pictures of all of this. And finally, do you see any bioengineering using natural materials, biodegradable materials? And we'll see some examples of that too. And once you've answered those questions, the last thing you're going to write down on the sheet is the GPS coordinates or the landmark at the end of the section. All right, let's look at some examples of what we're talking about here. Before I go on to that, I'll also mention that on the back of the sheet, this is the math I was telling you about. There's some quick calculations you can do with the calculator to get your overall section score that'll put it on a 0 to 100 scale. That makes it really easy to share with other people. All right, you remember, beginning from the top of the data form, we're going to look at photographic examples of each feature you'll be looking for. Remember, this assessment is done on each 1,000-foot section as a whole. We're not looking at individual lots. I know a lot of the pictures that I'm going to show you are zoomed in on individual lots, but what you're going to be doing is looking at 1,000 feet. So this is the part, that first pass, where you're just going to be counting homes and docks. And the question we sometimes get about docks is sometimes you have a simple dock, right? Where it just goes straight out and that's it. But sometimes you have, and that would count as one dock, but sometimes you have complicated structures like this one that may have room for multiple boats and that kind of thing. And so in that case, what I recommend is, you could count this as more than one dock. For example, if there's parking spaces for 3 or more boats at that location, you could count it as 2 or 3 or 4 docks, depending on how complicated of a setup you see. The next questions are about emergent and floating vegetation. And these are questions that you're going to answer when you're closer to shore and you can really see the plants well. When we talk about emergent and floating vegetation, this is the kind of stuff we're talking about. So lily pads, those are floating vegetation. Emergent vegetation are plants that stick up out of the water, like cattails and reeds, things like that. So that's what we mean by that. There's some more. We've got floating vegetation, emergent vegetation sticking up out of the water here. That all counts. Floating algae, if there's algae mats floating on the surface, that also counts when you're assessing how much of that 1,000-foot section has emergent or floating vegetation. Definitely count it. The next question asks you about submerged vegetation. So that's the plant life that's mostly growing underwater. And I'll ask you, as you look along that 1,000-foot section, what percentage of those 1,000 feet have submerged vegetation presence? It may also be growing quite low, deep under the water, and you'd still count it, even if it's growing quite low against the lake bottom like this is. The next question asks you if aquatic plant management is evident or known. And you would say no, or yes, but it's minor, or yes, and it's major. So a single bubbler that you see like this one is a minor example of aquatic plant management. But running an aquatic harvester to cut all the plants along that stretch, that's major mechanical management activity. There's other things too. For example, weed rollers that we're seeing here, a structure that rolls around on the water, on the lake bed and smothers the plants. If weed roller was being used in just a few places along the section, you might consider that minor aquatic plant management. But if everybody's doing it, like we see in this picture with nearly continuous removal of the aquatic vegetation, then that would be considered major. You've got a lot of disturbance to the submerged plant life along this stretch. The next question asks you about woody debris. And what we're talking about there is branches, logs, whole trees, things that are in the water, either have drifted in there or have fallen in from shore. And so partially or fully submerged wood does count. So trees that are, partly out of the water, but partly in the water, you would count that. And if the lake is unusually low while you're doing the survey, you can feel free to count wood that is currently exposed, but would normally be at least partially submerged. Concentrate your counting on pieces that are 3 inches or longer in diameter. You don't have to worry about counting every little twig that's in the lake. Here's some more examples of woody debris in the water. That's definitely providing cover, and you definitely gain points for having woody material along the lakeshore. So it's good stuff. Here's an example of some that was added intentionally. You may be kind of able to tell it's kind of evenly spaced, and it can, maybe looks like it was cut and that kind of thing. So this is part of a restoration project, this example here, where you see, you'd count 1, 2, 3, 4, and count them as you go along your 1,000-foot section. Another thing you might see is, again, lake wood that's been put in there on purpose to control erosion. If that's the case, you can count it during this part of the data sheet, but you should also consider it when you're assessing erosion control activities down at the bottom of the data form, and we'll come back to that. All right, your next questions are about erosion along the shoreline. Well, you'll say whether there's none, or maybe just minor occurrences across the 1,000-foot section, moderate or severe. So this is an example of a small area of erosion. You want to include erosion that is clearly the result of human activity, as well as erosion that may be caused by the forces of nature, like wind, waves, and ice. This situation is really quite common, what we're seeing here. There's erosion all along the stretch of lakeshore. It's probably not severe, like there's no hillside about to fall into the lake, but it's likely moderate because it's happening along a long stretch, and it appears that the property owner is trying to stop it by placing some rocks along the shore. Here's another example of something similar where you have erosion coming in, and you can see the lawn is kind of slumping into the water. And you might notice something common in a lot of these pictures, the mowed grass right up to the shore. That's often what we see when we have erosion, because turf grass has really short roots and doesn't provide a lot of stabilization. We saw this picture at the beginning, another example where you can see, raw soil. This slope is eroding. There's no vegetation growing here. And if you look carefully, you can see kind of light colored sand down here that probably got washed in off the shoreline from erosion. Here's a hill slope that is actively eroding. For this small stretch, at least, this erosion seems severe. And so if that happens across your, you see examples of that all along that 1,000-foot section, you definitely want to choose the severe option here. This property seems to have no vegetation on the slope at all and has the potential for serious erosion. But it's hard to know if it's actively eroding into the lake unless you maybe got a little bit closer. So that's probably what I do. I'd, get in there or get my binoculars out and see, okay, is it really eroding into the lake? Because it looks like there's definitely potential. So does a beach count as erosion? And the answer to that is only if there's active signs of the sand being lost into the lake. If your lake is naturally sandy, sand beaches might just be a natural feature and shouldn't be considered erosion. But if you can see that sand is washing into the lake from that beach, then yes, that's when you would count it as erosion. All right, the next question, it asks you about maintained lawn, maintained or artificial beach, and impervious surface. And you add that all up to see what percentage of the total 1,000 feet has that. I mean, you all know what a maintained lawn looks like. Here's an example of one. It's turf grass or other vegetation that's regularly mowed to use or appear as a lawn. In this picture, you also can see that there's some artificial erosion control happening, but we'll get to that in a minute. In this example, we see maintained lawn as well as a small impervious walkway. Impervious meaning solid material that water cannot flow through. So if it rains, it's not going to soak through these blocks. It's going to wash off. And so it's impervious. Impervious just means water cannot penetrate. So for this assessment, you would judge the percentage of section that is lawn, artificial beach, and impervious surface together. This is an interesting example because there is both lawn and impervious surface here. And so this is actually an easy one because they all get assessed together. Impervious surface. Here's an example of such a thing. Water can soak through these wood chips and maybe even through this gravel, but these blocks are so close together. This would be considered some impervious surface along the lakeshore. As with this, obviously, a concrete patio that's been installed right up to the water's edge. Here we have lawn and what is likely artificial beach here. I would suspect that sand was brought in for this beach. And there's a little bit of natural landscape over on this side. Here's that beach again. So here's where you'd for sure count it. It might not be erosion, but it's definitely artificial beach and artificial erosion control with those big boulders that were brought in. The next question is asking you about a belt of unmowed vegetation along that 1,000-foot section. How much of that section has unmowed vegetation? We're looking at some good stuff here, right? Unmowed vegetation. So you're going to look at what percentage of the 1,000-foot section has unmowed vegetation. And this can be any vegetation, herbaceous plants, shrubs, trees, and so on. And also you're going to look at, on average, how deep is that belt of unmowed vegetation? That is, how far does it stretch back from the water's edge? What we're seeing in this picture is fairly narrow, right? It only goes about this far, and then they start mowing behind that. So this is only a few feet of depth there. There appears to be some rock here that's been placed at the base of this unmowed vegetation belt, and that's okay. We can comment on that in the final section about shoreline erosion control practices, but this vegetation belt will still be counted towards unmowed vegetation. Here's another example of quite a narrow unmowed vegetation belt with rock below it. Still counts. It's not very deep, but it counts. Here's another example where you have unmowed vegetation reaching quite a ways back, even though, there's some tiers, there's some gravel walkways and so forth. I would say that the unmowed vegetation belt goes all the way back to this flat space where it appears they have a little lawn. So, that's definitely a deeper belt than what we saw in the previous pictures. And then this one goes back forever, right? If it goes dense enough and so far back that you can't see how far it goes back, then the category to choose is greater than 40 feet. Here's another example of a property that has a little bit of everything going on. You've got a really deep unmowed vegetation belt on the left-hand side, and then you have some mowed area where there's a little bit of unmowed vegetation here and so forth, a little bit here, none right here. So just to give you an example that, of course, it's going to vary when you're out there, and that's why you do your best estimate across the 1,000-foot section. All right, now the final section, looking at shoreline erosion control practices. An artificial control like steel and rock is what we're going to look at first. So the first category you're asked about is vertical artificial. So that includes structures like seawalls and boulder and rock walls that are built more or less up and down. So very traditional steel seawall shown here. Another example of a traditional steel seawall on kind of a point that goes out into the lake. Concrete or stone seawall structure here, with natural shoreline back beyond it. Large boulders and vertical walls of rock are also considered vertical artificial structures. Note here that what we have is a boulder wall in front of a concrete seawall. So it's definitely this vertical kind of artificial control. This is also considered vertical. And even though there's some slope to the boulders in front of the seawall, it doesn't pass what I like to call the turtle test. If a turtle has no chance of making it up onto dry land from water, we're going to call it vertical, right? Because it's basically creating a wall that cannot be passed by aquatic life. Here's another example. It's lower, it's not as tall, but it's still vertical. Now, sloped artificial. So this includes concrete, like smooth or broken pieces, and riprap or smaller rocks that is sloped up to the upland area. A turtle might struggle here too, but at least it has a chance, right? So if it has a slope to it, you'd count it under sloped artificial erosion control. Here's some sloped artificial concrete. And then another kind would be riprap. So it's a little hard to see in this picture because you're in your boat and you're kind of far out, but this is, broken up pieces of concrete that are sloped up into the upland area. This one used more natural smooth rocks. That also counts as sloped artificial. And even a small amount counts. And it also counts even if there's unmowed vegetation belt on top of it or behind it. You'd count that too, because that's definitely artificially placed. Like that's not natural. Somebody put that there. So it's artificial erosion control. Sometimes you'll see complicated situations like this. Is this count as sloped or vertical? At the foot of the slope, right down here, it's definitely sloped. It's sloped rock, sloped riprap. There are vertical rock walls that create terraces upland of that, but our turtle could probably get out. If you tried the turtle test, our turtle should be able to make it to dry land. So I'd call it sloped artificial. This one is seawall with some rock at the foot of it. It's still vertical. It still counts as vertical because see, there's no, even though the rock is below it, the turtle isn't going to be able to get out. Is this one vertical or sloped? Is it seawall or count as riprap? And I'd say it's potentially sloped. In the rear of the picture, the turtle might be able to make the transition. So, they're getting there. They could do a little better by having this sloped stone come up closer to the top of the seawall. Back here, it's looking a little better. Sometimes it's a judgment call. Honestly, this is a subjective program, and that's why we summarize across the entire section, and it all tends to average out and give you really useful information. Even though certain locations may give you a bit of a headache, don't stress about it too much. Do your best judgment and move on. The final category that erosion control that you might see is bioengineering or soft engineering erosion control. And you'll know, if you look at the scores on the sheet, you'll notice that while these areas don't get a positive score like a natural shoreline would, the score is less negative than artificial structures like seawalls. Because although erosion is being dealt with, it's being dealt with in a way that eventually, with proper maintenance, will be indistinguishable from a natural shoreline. The shoreline will be considered recovered at that point. And I would also say, if you happen to know on your lake of an area where bioengineering was installed years ago, and now most people wouldn't be able to tell that it ever happened, it looks natural, then that shoreline should be considered recovered and not included in the percent of shoreline with evident bioengineering. So what we're looking at here is core logs that have been placed. These are made of natural fibers, typically coconut fiber, rolled up into log shapes and staked into the ground. And then native plants and with deep root structures are planted among them. We can zoom in a little bit closer here. You can see how the plants are planted in there. And eventually the natural material, the logs will rot away. But by that time, the plants that have been planted, if they're maintained properly, will be established and their deep roots will hold the soil in place. And you won't need that extra artificial structure, even though it's made from natural materials, it won't be needed anymore. So you may see that there. And that's the most lake-friendly way to deal with erosion issues that you might find. You may see it over a large piece of section of shoreline. This was a local government project on some county-owned land. Another kind of bioengineering would be bringing in, wood, right? Natural stumps, bundles of brush or branches. And remember this picture we saw in the woody debris section. You can also include it in your assessment of the extent of bioengineering in this section, because all of these stumps were added to this property to keep the soil in place and prevent erosion. What about stuff like this? It's artificial erosion control, right? People are trying. They've got some cinder blocks and some landscape stone just kind of piled up against their shoreline to prevent erosion. So I would apply my turtle test. I would think that it looks like a turtle could probably make its way up into this brush. So I'd call it sloped artificial. Again, another kind of failing attempt at a seawall. Looks like maybe some railroad ties were put in. I would probably call this vertical artificial. I'm not sure a turtle could get through, maybe right in here, but it's looking pretty rough right through there. The structure is pretty large, even though it's starting to fail. All right, that's the end of the pictures that I'm going to show you as examples. Every lake looks different, but hopefully we covered a number of the situations you may encounter when you're out doing your assessment. Another thing that we definitely encourage is for you to take pictures of what you see. This will be a really useful reference for you to remember what you saw, especially if you saw examples of particularly bad erosion or also particularly good things. If you saw examples of property owners that are doing a really good job of maintaining natural shoreline on their property, you can use those pictures to say, hey, look, congratulations to this person. They're doing a really good job. We should all, think about what we can do to be like this. So taking pictures are really helpful. You can also upload pictures with your data into the MiCorps database. You can only upload 3 pictures per section, and they can't be more than 5 megabytes each. So you can't overwhelm us with pictures in the database, but they can be saved. So that's really nice. And it's really helpful to label your pictures with the section number so you don't lose track of where you took those pictures. And that can be done by just recording where you took pictures on a piece of paper. Another thing that I've seen done that I think is really clever is people will take a small dry erase board with them out onto the boat. And when they're taking a picture, they'll write on the dry erase board, like the number of the section, maybe even some description of what it's a picture of, and hold it up so it's in the picture when they take the picture, and then they don't forget what that picture was supposed to be showing. When it's time to submit your data, just like you do with all of our other parameters, you go to micorps.net to the data exchange, click on enter data, and you'll be able to log in and enter data for your lake. Now, right now, one thing to keep in mind is that you can't stop once you get started on the Score the Shore data. You can walk away from your computer, but you can't close your browser, your internet website while you're doing it. Because if you leave and then try and log in again later to finish, it's going to start over, and you'll be able to enter data, but it won't connect the two, and we'll end up with multiple records for your lake, and we'll just have to delete it all and start again. So we don't want to waste your effort. So, keep that computer open, keep that browser window open until you're done. When you are entering your data, be sure to also send us a copy of your forms and your pictures. You can mail them to us in an envelope through the mail, or you can email them to us. If you scan them or take a picture of them and send us electronic copies, that works great too. Include that cover sheet, a data form for every section that you did, a map of where all your sections were, and then you can hang on to your photographs. We don't need printed photographs. If you want to send digital photos, you can. All right, that wraps it up. Are there any questions? And maybe Eric can let me know if there's questions that came in.
That was great, Joe. Yeah, we have a question. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand. So first one, how far back do we consider a riparian zone? My lake is rimmed with a dirt road 1 to 20 feet from the shore. How do I consider this?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, when you're counting houses and docks, do everything you can see. So you can probably see across the road, at least some of the houses, so you'd count those. But then when you're talking about the actual riparian zone and answering questions to that, it sounds to me like it pretty much stops at the road. That's because that kind of severs the landscape in some ways. So when you're in the section where you have a road and there's just a small strip of land between the road and the lake, then just count between the lake and the road.
Thank you. Can you talk about channels?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of lakes have channels or canals. They may be natural, they may be artificially built or dug out sometime in the past. And so you can certainly assess along your channels if you want to, and those could be separate sections, right, in your assessment. However, in a lot of cases, we emphasize staying in the main part of the lake, right, and doing the work there. Because once you start getting up into channels, you just added a whole lot of extra shoreline, right? There's not much water, but a whole lot of shoreline when it comes to channels. So you do have some discretion. If you want to go up into the channels and assess there, you're welcome to do that. But in a lot of cases, partly just to keep the amount of time it's going to take to do the assessment reasonable, focusing on the lake itself is probably definitely where you want to start. And then if you decide you want to add some channel work, you could do that.
Perfect. Should we also score islands?
Yeah, that's a great idea. And so yes, if you have an island, it has shoreline. Now, if the whole shoreline is significantly less than 1,000 feet total, it may not be that useful, right? It's going to be like a little mini section in your assessment. So if you figure out that actually, wow, this island isn't very big, then it might not be worthwhile. But if it's big enough to get close to that 1,000-foot section or bigger, then I'd say for sure, go ahead and do it.
Thank you, Joe. We have a few minutes that we can still have chance to answer some questions. Joe and I can also answer questions about other things as well. Or we will enter into our break. Here's a new one from Jim. My lake has a weed eradication program, chemical and mechanical. Do I score before or after, or both?
Great question. So you don't have to limit yourself on when you do this based on when weed management is happening in your lake, because you're aware of it, right? And so in the question that asks about is aquatic vegetation management happening, you know where it's happening. I'm guessing either that it's all over the lake or it's just in certain sections. If you're aware of it, then assess on what you're aware of, even if it's not visible. Maybe it hasn't happened yet, right? If you go out earlier in the season, they haven't done what they're planning to do. You would still assess that. The other question that it gets to, right, is about the extent of submerged vegetation along each section. And if it's, it was there in June, but you went and surveyed in July and it had been sprayed and killed and it wasn't evident anymore. I would record what you see when you're out there, do what you actually see, what extent of plant life is there. If there isn't any there, then it's not there, right? And so I would assess it that way. So the plant life, do what you see, and you can do your survey whenever you want. Don't let that change when you do your survey. And on aquatic plant management, do what you see, but also what you're aware of activity that's going on.